Hi, everyone. I'm Addison Stark, Associate Director for Energy Innovation at the Bipartisan Policy Center and Staff Director for the American Energy Innovation Council. I'm joined today by Dr. Dorothy Robyn to discuss a case study that she recently wrote for our AEIC Scaling Innovation Project on the role of technology demonstrations at the Department of Defense and potential lessons that can be drawn for the Department of Energy. A bit about Dorothy. She's a former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Installations and Environment, and she has also served as Commissioner for Public Buildings in the the General Services Administration. She is currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University. Dorothy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Addison. Great to be here.
So, Dorothy, I just want to jump right in. In your paper, you look back at the rich history of technology demonstrations at the Department of Defense and how these demonstration programs were used to catalyze major private investments into the technologies of interest. One thing that comes to mind is the fly-off you point to.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So DOD uses demonstrations, technology demonstrations, for all kinds of different purposes. The fly-offs are a feature of the weapons acquisition process, and that's the major place where DOD uses technology demonstrations when they're developing a weapons system. And those demonstrations, their primary purpose is to reduce risk. Senior military officers set requirements for a new weapons system, but don't necessarily have a clear understanding of just exactly how long it would take to achieve the capability or at what cost. And so by building and testing these systems, you can identify what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the unknown unknowns. Secondly, they allow DOD to explore trade-offs between cost and the performance of a new system. If you have certain capabilities that the military really wants, but they drive extraordinarily high costs, then you can identify that and potentially eliminate that. And then the third is to leverage competition, and that's where private investment comes in. Now, it's a kind of a circular system with defense contractors. The DOD is its own market, and the defense contractors at the end of the day are going to get paid for what they invest. But DOD does try to structure its demonstrations in such a way as to take advantage of competition, to have contractors competing with one another, building, say, a prototype, and that's where you can get it. You have a fly-off. And contractors are doing that in the hopes of being selected as the prime contractor ultimately. But if the demonstration process is structured as a competition, then they will often spend as much of their own money as they are getting from DOD to conduct the demonstration. And they will also reveal a lot more about features, about technologies that they have developed that would be particularly helpful. So competition is a really key feature of demonstrations that incentivizes a lot of good behavior on the part of private contractors.
Following on that, one thing you point out is the fact that DOD and DOE are very different organizations working to develop technologies for very different end users, as you point out.
Right.
With DOD technologies going to DOD ultimately, but in DOE, technologies needing to compete in a highly regulated commodity market. What lessons from DOD do you think are portable to DOE for technology demonstrations?
Yeah, I struggled with this in the beginning. Should I even write this paper, because DOD and DOE are so different. DOD, and it really is the reason that the Department of Defense is such an extraordinary engine of technological innovation. It is developing technology for its own use. No other federal agency is in that situation. NASA maybe, but on a very small scale. But what DOD does is develop technology for its own use. That is why, at the end of the day, it is so effective. There are some other reasons that I'll mention. DOE is their technology is ultimately aimed at a commercial audience at a commercial market. And so that's quite a bit different. But at the end of the day, I concluded that the way DOD goes about this really has a lot of lessons for DOE. And the first one is just the extraordinary importance of technology demonstrations to innovation. I mean, that is the big lesson from DOD. DOD cannot conceive of doing innovation without technology demonstration. And I sum that up by saying that, like cold climate populations that have 50 words for snow, DOD has 50 words for demonstration. Demonstrations come in all shapes and sizes, and they are just a central part of the innovation process. That is not really true at the Department of Energy. Now, this is less of a lesson for DOE itself. I think people in the Department of Energy recognize the importance of demonstration. It's really more a lesson for people in Congress who are skeptical as to whether the Department of Energy really needs to be funding something that far downstream. And I think the answer is yes, they do. DOE has had a difficult it's had a very checkered history in conducting demonstrations or funding demonstrations, and that hence the congressional skepticism. But I think you want to deal with that separately. So lesson number one, innovation and technology demonstration inextricably linked. Lesson number two, know your customer. DOD knows its customer because it is its own customer. DOE, as I said, has a harder road to hoe in looking at commercial markets, but I think that the way that DOD goes about doing demonstrations, its very customer-oriented approach is directly relevant to DOE. Number one, conduct the demonstration in very lifelike real-world conditions. For DOD, that means simulating battlefield-like conditions. For DOE, that means making it as commercial as possible. Number two, give industry, the entities carrying out the demonstration, a great deal of control. DOD supervises the demonstration, but the contractors really figure out how they're going to go about doing it. They exercise an enormous control over the process. In DOE, that has not always been the case. DOE gets quite involved in it. DOE is constrained by federal acquisition regulations, by personnel regulations. They are limited in the degree to which they can allow their large-scale demonstrations to be commercial in nature, and at the end of the day, that's a problem. I had a third one. Oh yes, insulate the demonstration from political influence, and there again, I think DOE has had a challenge with Congress wanting to intervene. So, ironically, the lesson of DOD, know your customer, for DOE is make your demonstrations as commercial as possible. And I think that's not easy under current conditions, which I think leads to some recommendations.
So what I want to touch on there is that last point that you made that I think needs to be elaborated on further. One thing that you point out is DOD's technology demonstrations have been insulated by politics largely, but this has not always been the case for DOE. From your standpoint, what would you recommend policymakers trying to design new energy technology demonstration programs in order to insulate them better?
I think you've got to either take that capability out of the Department of Energy or put it in an office that has a lot of political insulation. DOD doesn't have to do that. So DOD's technology activities are largely, not entirely, insulated from politics. There's certainly, there's a lot of, certainly DOD's budget is very political, but their technology activities, their RDT&E, research, development, test, and evaluation, is by and large politically insulated. I think at the end of the day, that is largely because of their mission, national security. That mission is in the Constitution. That mission conveys a lot of seriousness, and people, Congress is loath to muck around in that, micromanage that. And then also there's a lot of scrutiny, GAO and other watchdog agencies. DOE doesn't have those advantages. So I think structurally they need to separate that capability. And I think that you're doing it not just for political insulation, but also to allow the demonstrations to be conducted in a more commercial manner for all the reasons I talked about before. So you want to exempt it from federal acquisition regulations. You want the entity to be able to hire and fire without the constraints of the federal personnel system. I am very partial to the John Deutsch of MIT, his proposal for a energy technology corporation, which would be a quasi-independent entity outside of the Department of Energy that would be in charge of large-scale energy demonstration projects. That may be a bridge too far politically, but I think creating a capability inside of DOE that is insulated and exempt from some of these requirements that keep them, including congressional interference, that keep them from being able to have these demonstrations be as commercial like as possible.
Well, Dorothy, thanks very much for joining me today, walking us through some of these ideas, and it was really helpful to have you as part of this process.
Great. Thanks very much, Addison.